Hello, everyone. My name is Brennan Marr. That noise you're hearing is my little later. And welcome to Page Turners They Were Not, my Star Wars podcast. Today, we're going to talk about Stanley Kubrick's 1960 classic, Spartacus, and how, in my mind, it relates to Star Wars. So, let's begin by talking about this film. The story behind the making of Spartacus is just as fascinating as the movie itself. But let's talk about the movie first. The movie Spartacus tells the story of a slave gladiator who leads a revolt against the Roman Republic in the last days before the rise of the Roman Empire. This is a true story, though not much details are known. Spartacus was a real person who did indeed lead a revolt. This story was turned into a novel by Howard Fast. The novel was then adapted to the film. Now, some of you may be more familiar with the recent Spartacus series, which I have not seen, so I can't really comment on. The 1960 film is a classic, featuring an all-star cast, including Kirk Douglas as Spartacus. It also features great British actors, Laurence Olivier, Charles Laughton, and Peter Ustinov, as well as American actors like John Gavin and Tony Curtis. Speaking of another British actor I forgot, the great Gene Simmons. The movie is beautifully photographed, I must say. The copy that I have on Blu-ray looks fantastic. In fact, they've done such a good job, you don't even see grain in the image. The movie features great cinematography, great score by Alex North, some very great performances, particularly from Peter Ustinov and Laurence Olivier. And he's really one of the great Roman epics. And one of the last successful Roman epics. As the next big Roman epic was Cleopatra, which did not do as well at the box office. Spartacus received 4 Academy Awards, including Best Supporting Actor for Peter Ustinov as slave trainer Spartacus. Now, the movie, in my mind, shares similarities to Gladiator, in the idea of a slave gladiator who challenges the might of Rome. This is a film that I would highly recommend. Now, it's about 3 hours long, but it's worth it. And it features a great mix of military, or rather war, a great battle scene at the end, as well as a nice mix of politics, Machiavellianism, and other such amazing things of that era. It's really interesting because Roman ethics in the years following this movie just were missing something, and I think that was a sense of emotionally connecting with the audience. And this movie does, because it remembers to keep its focus on where it should be, on the emotional heart of the story of Spartacus himself. Spartacus is a well-realized character, as are all the other characters. One thing that I do find funny to comment on the accents. In traditional Roman ethic fashion, the good guys speak with American accents, and the bad guys speak with British accents. Now, it's funny because the American actors sound about as American as you can get. It's like Tony Curtis and others desperately trying to hide their accents. In his case, Tony Curtis had a strong New York accent, so he's trying to hide it. And so that can be a little funny, but otherwise it's a good film. Now, the initial reception of this movie was a little muted. I mean, people enjoyed it, but it wasn't exactly a triumphant reception, so to speak. And over time, I think its reputation has grown. In fact, so far as to be included in the AFI's list of the greatest American films on their 2007 list. So it really has grown in its reputation. Okay, let me talk really briefly about the behind the scenes. Now, this film went through two directors. The original director was Tony Mann, who would later direct El Cid. The reasons I believe that he left were conflicts with Kirk Douglas. But Kirk Douglas was the executive producer of this movie, and he was really the man to get the movie off the ground. The novel was adapted into the film by Dalton Trumbo. Now, Trumbo, as you may recall, was blacklisted. Now, what was the blacklist? Well, in the 50s, during the communist witch hunts, McCarthyism, many people in Hollywood were blacklisted as having possible communist ties. This included screenwriter Dalton Trumbo, who basically went into hiding and had to use a pen name. Had to use a pseudonym to write screenplays. But in the case of Spartacus, everybody behind the film, including the studio, said, screw it, we are going to let Trumbo use his real name on this screenplay. And so in the credits it said screenplay by Dalton Trumbo, no longer by his pseudonym of Sam Jackson. Now, obviously, as you can imagine, this was met with some pushback with the press and other right-wing groups like the American Legion and other real red-blooded Americans pushing back, saying, you let this communist make this movie? There were pickets and protests at movie theaters. In fact, President Kennedy famously crossed a picket line to see the movie in a theater, basically giving his support to it, which was helpful. Now, despite all the protestations, this spelled the end of the blacklist. The blacklist was broken by an act of courage by those involved in this film. Similar to how Stan Lee broke the Comics Code Authority when he said, screw you, I'm publishing one of my comics anyway. So sometimes it takes an act of courage to break through these barriers. So there's so much more that can be said, and a lot has been said about the behind the scenes of this movie. Let's just say not everybody got along. A lot of egos colliding among the actors and the filmmakers. And everybody kind of having their own ego, being very egocentric. So there's a lot there, so you should read about it because it is a fascinating story. And the movie is too. So it's kind of it's a 2-for-1. If this is a film you have not seen, I highly recommend it. And I highly recommend that you also study about the behind the scenes of this movie. But it has gone down in history as one of the great Roman ethics. And I look back at some of the initial reactions and I'm like, I just don't see it. People saying that, the drama gets lost in the, in the big spectacle. I don't agree with that sentiment. Now, you might disagree. But by all means, see this film if you have not. Okay, we're going to take a break to hear about our sponsor. And when we come back, I'll give you my connections to Star Wars. See you in a moment. Hello there, this is Brennan Marr, host of Page Turners They Were Not, a Star Wars podcast. And I'm here to tell you about Anchor. Anchor is the best way to make a podcast. Why is that? Well, first off, it's free. Yes, you heard me right. Anchor is free. Anchor has all the tools you need to make a podcast from your phone or your computer. Anchor will distribute your podcast for you on various platforms, including Spotify and Apple Podcasts. You can make money from your podcast. And get this, with no minimum listenership. That means you can make money even if no one listens to your podcast. That, of course, is not ideal, as Anchor will allow you to spread your podcast, bring in more viewers, and you can make more money because of it. Everything you need to make a podcast is in one place on Anchor. If you're interested, download the free Anchor app or go to anchor.fm to get started. Thank you, and may the Force be with you. Okay. And that was a word about Anchor. Okay. What connections does this film have to Star Wars? Okay. Well, the story of Spartacus is set during the waning years of the Roman Republic. When the Republic was crumbling, as people in the Senate and other groups were jockeying to outmaneuver each other. Sounds a bit like what was going on in the Star Wars prequel trilogy, with the last days of the Galactic Republic. And there is a lot of Machiavellian politics going on in Spartacus. Several groups, kind of camps, so to speak, positioning themselves against each other, jockeying for control. Reminds me a little bit of what we see in the prequel trilogy, particularly The Phantom Menace, but also in the Clone Wars series, which has a lot of that and does it well, I think. And I think that the prequels actually do the politics fairly well, except maybe for taxation of trade routes. That never made sense. But the idea of different groups in the Senate jockeying for power, the idea of people trying to gain more power, aka Palpatine. So we get a little bit of that. We also get the fact that Spartacus is a slave. Well, Anakin was a slave. And like Spartacus, Anakin went pretty far. Also, we get some gladiatorial combat. This reminds me a little bit of the arena in Episode 2, Attack of the Clones. Very Romanesque. Very pulp sci-fi. So, we get some of that, and I really think that as a film, Star Wars, throughout the saga, has been very Roman epic-like. Very much the might of empires, fascist dictatorships. Now, even though Spartacus is not set during the Roman Empire, but rather the Roman Republic, the age of the dictator was at hand. And you could already see people with more power than they should have in Spartacus and in the Star Wars prequels. But Star Wars overall has a Roman ethic feel. Particularly, at least in the original trilogy, the trope, as I mentioned earlier, of the good guys speaking with American accents and the bad guys speaking with British accents. Very much in the Roman tradition. Giving the idea that the Romans were patricians. The common folks were more Americans, more down to earth, where there is no nobility. Star Wars definitely goes with that trope all throughout the saga. And those are really, to me, the chief connections. Also, the idea of the nobility making sport out of human lives is a little bit like, you see that quite a bit in Star Wars, of whether it's the pod racing or the arena in Episode 2. It's kind of making sport out of human life. Or alien life, in the case of Star Wars. But nonetheless, the life of sentient beings. Those are really the connections that I see between Spartacus and Star Wars. And I'm sure that there are more to be found. Now, one final note about the movie Spartacus before we end. Stanley Kubrick, because he did not have complete creative control on the movie, always looked down upon the film as being the film that really wasn't the one that he wanted. And it was the only film where he was not allowed to kind of do what he wanted. So even though he never considered this one of his films, in the traditional sense, I respectfully disagree and believe that this is a very great film from a very great filmmaker. So, that's my thoughts on Spartacus and Star Wars. If you see this film or have seen it, let me know if you see any connections to Star Wars. And also let me know your thoughts on this film. My name is Brendan Marr. That noise you hear is my ventilator. And thank you for tuning in to Page Turners They Were Not, my Star Wars podcast. May the Force be with you.